we go. So, yeah, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar of the Clean Bus Europe platform. Today, the topic is European Policy Framework for Clean Bus Deployment. Everyone is very interested in this topic today, definitely not just because of the geopolitical reasons we obviously are experiencing since the end of February, but because we are already almost 1 year into the, let's say, the entering into force of the Clean Vehicle Directive. Today we have with us Lucie Petersen. She is our dear colleague of the European Department at UITP, and she will be guiding us today through this topic. We have already gathered some comments from members, platform members, but also bus committee members. You know, UITP has different committees also working on several topics. The bus committee is the one gathering bus operators and authorities as observers. So we do have already some concerns raised by members of the bus committee as well. And we will be trying to address this today with Lucie. Lucie, I would perhaps let yourself introduce you. So I think it's the best way to kick off. And then after that, we would go through the agenda. Please feel free also to go through the agenda yourself, and then we just start. Thanks.
That works for me. Thank you, Ida. Like Ida said, I'm Lucie. I work in UITP's European department, which means I work primarily on European legislation on our lobbying efforts towards the EU institutions. And for me specifically, that means working on energy and fuel related topics. I joined UITP in 2018, which was right when the work on the Clean Vehicles Directive kicked off. So that was a very intensive process that took quite a long time, but I was lucky enough to be able to follow the entire process. So I have accumulated one or two thoughts on the topic, and happy to be here today. I will just give you a brief overview of what we'll be doing today. So welcome and introduction, we can already check that one off the agenda. I will then give you an overview, first of all, of how to understand the Clean Vehicles Directive, what it is actually about, and then looking more specifically at Germany as an example of how it could be done and what some challenges are. Then I'll give you a bit of a larger picture about the European legislative framework and also an outlook of what we can expect potentially to come in the future. For today's goal, I want you to go away with a better understanding of what the policy framework looks like, especially on a European level. If we can, in the discussion afterwards, find some insights on how operators can support each other, how we can exchange about the topics to be better prepared, that would be a great outcome. We will have some time to discuss at the end of the session after my presentation, but I also encourage you, I've got 3 segments, and after each segment, I'll make a brief pause to see if you've got any questions, so you don't need to wait until the end and might have forgotten about the questions already. And then, like I said, we will also be looking at what you can expect in the future, especially also in the geopolitical surroundings that Ida mentioned already. Ida, do you want to take over for this point? And yes, I'm happy to share the presentation afterwards.
Yes, thanks a lot. Yeah, just a brief reminder, I think everyone already has learned this quite well. It's 2 years or over 2 years we are holding these online meetings, but please, I would remind everyone to mute yourself. Then you can use the chat to place your questions, or of course, raise your hands with the icon hand raised. We will then be able to give you the word. And also, I see more colleagues are arriving. Again, a reminder for the ones just arriving now, the session is being recorded. Okay, so that's it. So as Lucie already introduced you to the topics, definitely this is a workshop that is going to be valuable if you contribute with your questions and help us to understand how can we support you better to get into the insights of this topic. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Let's start off with the very first topic. So what do you need to know about the Clean Vehicles Directive? going to start out with a very simple question. What is the Clean Vehicles Directive and why are we looking at it? So it's an EU directive, which means it's European rules that are made on the EU level, but then need to be transposed into national law. So they don't apply directly, just to clarify that right off. It's not a new directive. We previously had a version from 2009, but it was updated in quite a lengthy process between the end of 2017 and finally published in summer of 2019. And that's the current version that we're talking about, which is already in force. The problem that the Commission tried to address with the Clean Vehicles Directive is really the chicken or the egg problem of clean bus deployment. Do you start with creating a demand for clean buses, additional to the one that we already had from operators, from authorities, or do you start with requiring bus manufacturers to produce cleaner buses in large quantities? The Commission decided to go with the first of the two options, mainly because it's easier to ask the public sector to do something than to ask the private industry to do something. So the aim of the clean vehicles was to use public procurement to increase the demand for clean buses and therefore accelerate the deployment of clean vehicles in Europe. That has a very large background that we're looking at. If we look at the scope, and I'm going to try to keep it very light on the legislative details, but I will have to go a bit in the more legal concerns of this. You have to look at, we've got these rules. What do they actually apply to? Who are they addressed to? What are they talking about? In terms of vehicles, we are looking at the vehicle categories that I've listed on here. You'll see that a piloted M3 class 1 and A, that basically means city buses. And in terms of vehicles, it's not just buses, it's also cars, vans, trucks, and of course buses. What's not included is coaches, also more particular vehicles for agriculture and forestry, procurements that are very, very small, so below the EU procurement thresholds. And there's some exempting possibilities for member states as well, for example, for fire trucks, for ambulances, etc. It applies not to all cars, for example, so not to private cars, but only to certain types of contracts. And the one that I think is most relevant for you today is public service contracts, which is often the format used for public transport, but also contracts on the purchase, lease, rent, or hire purchase of road vehicles. And then other services as well, less relevant for you, but for example, trucks for mail delivery, vans that are used in services like that. So this is what we're looking at. If we talk about contracts today, keep in mind those are the ones that we are talking about. So just as a guideline, the ones that you use to organise public transport locally are probably the ones that are concerned here. Very big question, and the one that I've been asked the most on this topic. What is a clean bus? We're saying it's a Clean Vehicles Directive. What does that actually mean? There's a list of technologies specifically for buses because there was no CO2 emission standards that the Commission wanted to refer to. So they chose to go with a list that already exists in a different directive, which is the AFI directive on the deployment of alternative fuels infrastructure. So that means they went to the list and said, look, a clean bus is everything that uses one of the fuels that are listed here. So we have electricity. That includes plug-in hybrids, but not full hybrids. It also includes trolleybuses, for example. We have hydrogen, natural gas, including biomethane, CNG, LNG, most biofuels, synthetic and paraffinic fuels, and LPG. And then there's a specific definition of a zero-emission vehicle, and that's basically your average electric bus, fuel cell, hydrogen-using vehicle. Basically anything that has barely any trace amounts of CO2 is called zero emission in this context. When we're talking about this list, it's important to note that we are just talking about tailpipe. So when we're talking about electricity, it doesn't matter whether it's coal-related energy or solar energy. It's just electricity as itself is counted as a clean vehicle if the vehicle uses that electricity. So not a well-to-wheel approach, as we call it, but a tank-to-wheel approach. The one new big thing that the newer version of the Clean Vehicles Directive introduced is mandatory, so binding procurement targets. And I'm just going up the ones for buses, the separate ones for cars and vans and trucks. But these are the ones that we are interested in since, well, it's a bus platform, so we're just going to be talking about buses here. So you can see there's two different periods that we are looking at. The first reference period, as we call them, is the one that we're already in today. So from 2021 to the end of 2025. And there's a second one that starts just after and goes to the end of 2030. You can see on the left that the quotas are slightly lower for the first segment. These are the quotas. They're slightly different for some of the member states, but these are the ones that apply for 12 of the member states. So this is as high as they go. For some other member states where the Commission esteemed they had less economic capabilities, some more difficulties, the quotas are lower, but this is the maximum. So you can see that we've got basically two larger quotas. So there's a big part, 55%, where we still have no quota. Then there's the rest in the first period, 45%, that has to be fulfilled with clean vehicles. And half of that, so the green part here, has to be fulfilled with zero emission vehicles. And you can see on the right that this increases for the second period. In terms of technologies, this means that there's still quite a large percentage where operators and authorities have free choice. So in the first 55%, but later on 35%, you can do that with anything, diesel, full hybrid, electric buses, whatever you choose. Then there's a second part where you are limited to the list of technologies that we were just looking at. And then the very smaller part is zero emission vehicles. So this is the quotas that you need to keep in mind if you're looking at the Clean Vehicles Directive. If you're interested in finding out what the ones are for your country, let me know, but this is the basic ones that are going on. One of the big questions we always got is, yes, buses, but what about the infrastructure and how are we going to pay for bus infrastructure and buses? Quite simply, the Commission didn't foresee anything in that particular directive. There's, of course, existing funding programs. There's the Connecting Europe facility. There's new alternative fuels facility within the Connecting Europe facility. Lots of different names to say there's some EU programs that already exist, but the Clean Vehicles Directive does not create any new funding, and it does not foresee setting of infrastructure in any way. So that means it's a big challenge, and that was also something that we pointed out to the Commission during the legislative process. Let me just say that we did a lot of lobbying on this file, and this is the version that is, I would say, a bit more friendly on operators and authorities compared to what some of the legislators, especially in the European Parliament, were suggesting. Some of them were, for example, suggesting 100% zero emission quotas. So we still have some flexibility, but it is true that this directive will significantly impact the way that we can procure buses in the next years to come. The timeline, once again, looking at these reference periods. So the directive already entered into force. We have the quotas that already apply. You can see we're here today in the middle of the first reference periods. So that means all contracts that are starting now, where the call for competition or the notice is launched, so anytime after August 2021, already falls under the Clean Vehicles Directive. And what does that mean specifically? Because there are some tricky bits that I want to address as well. So these aren't annual quotas. There's a reason we talk about reference periods. It means that the targets apply to the total number of road vehicles that are covered by the entirety of the contracts in that specific country in that reference period. So basically, you can only know at the end of the period whether you've fulfilled that quota. Of course, there's monitoring, but it means that you're not looking on a year-to-year basis, but you're really looking at the whole reference period. I will go into a bit more detail on how the quotas work, but the short version is that the member states decide on how the quotas are applied themselves. And one part that I want to highlight is you need to be careful because the CVD does not only apply to new buses. It applies to contracts, which means that if you start a new public service contract and you have a procurement process for that, all vehicles that are used for the provision of the service are counted. So not just the ones that you're buying or you're renting, the new ones, but also the ones that you already have in your fleet. that can go two ways. You can say that's very difficult because we're going to have a large fleet that is still quite predominantly diesel based. But it also means that any electric buses, for example, that you've already purchased can be counted in the contracts that they are used for in the years to come. So it's not like if you procured an electric bus in 2020, that will not count towards the quotas. It will be counted as well if you use it in a new contract that starts after the CBEP. And like I said, member states do have quite some flexibility. That's why it's a directive, not a regulation that would apply directly. So we have these quotas. They are just one number for a 5-year period for each country. And the member states get to decide what they want to do with that specifically. So they could say, you need to apply that to each contract, not very likely. You can say each company within that period needs to make sure that it meets the quota. You could say larger companies, bigger front-runner cities, for example, would have to play a larger part, or you could just break it down to the regional or even to the national level if you've got associations that can help work with that. So these are the very basic points of understanding the Clean Vehicles Directive. Before going over to the way the CBD is currently looking in Germany, are there any questions? Don't hesitate. There's no stupid questions. If there's anything that's unclear, let me know. Uli, I see you've got your hand raised.
Yes, hi, thank you. Yeah, I would like to ask a question in relation to the kind of contracts that you had at the beginning. There was 3 types of contracts: the one for the purchase of the vehicle, and then also the contract for public transport services. What does it mean to have a new service with vehicles that are maybe 10 years old? So you begin a service with old vehicles. Does it mean that the directive has to apply for these old vehicles, or how do you translate that into the new purchases? Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. Yes, this relates to the last part that I was mentioning about this bit on public service contracts, actually. So this was a question we also had and which we asked to the Commission. And the Commission clarified that in the guidance document that they published after the Clean Vehicles Directive was already in force. And they said specifically that it's not new vehicles only, it's also, and in your case, it would be the 10-year-old buses would also count. It doesn't mean that you can't do the contract, because once again, the quotas don't necessarily apply to each contract. But it would mean that if you've got 10 old buses, 20 new ones, then those two numbers would go into the national pot for looking at what kind of vehicles you procured throughout the 5-year period, if that makes sense. So at the end, each year, or each time you have a contract, you would submit what you're doing in terms of contract. How many vehicles do you have? How many of them are clean? How many of them are zero emission? And all of that gets aggregated in the end, and then you're going to look whether the quota has been met. Just clarify how these quotas work. The EU doesn't have that many options what they can do when a member state does not meet that quota. I don't say that to discourage you from trying to reach the quotas, but just for better understanding, in case quotas aren't being met, the Commission has the option to sue a member state, but it is unfortunately somewhat current that member states do not meet bigger targets like that in the time frame they are supposed to. So that's just as a contextualization of how binding these quotas are. They are legally binding, they are mandatory, but the company isn't going to get sued. So just to ease some consciences. I think I will just move on to the next point. If you've got any questions after that, feel free, but this might illustrate a bit more what we're talking about. So I wanted to look at Germany for several reasons. First of all, we have Germany as one of the countries that has the maximum amount of quotas, so somewhat representative for many other countries. It also did a very close transposition of the directive, so it's basically one-to-one. And we've also got some insights from the National Association VDV, which I'm also detached by, so I've got some insights in there as well. The quotas in Germany, which is the interesting part, how do the quotas apply? So Germany decided to break this down based on the level of the federal states. There's 16 overall in Germany. So then again, the federal states have to supervise this and decide how to apply it on their local administrative layer, so cities, regions, counties, whatever they have. But the federal states also have several options. So they can decide to band together. For example, if there's several smaller ones, several bigger ones, smaller and bigger ones that want to say, we're going to do the quota together, we're going to try to fulfill this together, then they can do that. And they can also make agreements with sector associations. And that's where VDV, the German Transport Association, comes in, can decide to try and have the sector work out as well how the quotas can be fulfilled. So still quite some flexibility, but an interesting approach to go to a sort of regional method. And the CBD, to be precise, is addressed to contracting authorities. So it's not addressed to the individual transport operator, but instead to the contracting authorities who then need to make sure in the tenders, in the offers, that the targets are met. So it's more on a political side that the decisions are being made. In terms of monitoring, because I've got that question a lot, how does monitoring work? There's a rule in Europe, there's the Tenders Electronic Daily Database, TED. So the procurements, the contracts are already submitted online. And with the further development of some of the procedures behind that, it's still ongoing, unfortunately, it will be easier to also submit information about the CBD online as well. So Germany provided a CBD implementation guide for e-procurement service providers. So for the ones that are helping companies to do the procurement submitting online. So there are some requirements for contracting authorities and entities to provide the data. So basically, whenever you have a new contract, you're going to submit some data, and that's the one that's going to at the end count. So once again, basically, you have a contract, you submit, I have 20 vehicles that I'm using for that contract. Out of that, 10 are clean, and out of those 10, 5 are zero emission. And that way, the numbers get aggregated over the different countries and time periods. And another interesting question is, where does money come from? Do we have funding? Germany, quite a good example for that, because they actually managed to do quite a substantial funding program for electric, clean buses, largely electric, some other types as well in there. So there was a first call, and this was actually just okay this year. So the first call is 600 million in total. It will cover for each one that gets some money out of it, 80% of additional costs. That's the maximum level you can get. So basically of the additional costs you have, because you have to, for example, buy an electric bus instead of a diesel one, which are more expensive. And overall, a positive as well as negative point is, on one side, we got 1,700 buses funded, but there were 5,000 applications. So it shows that with additional funding, the sector could go a lot quicker, and that there's a lot of demand. So many companies across the country are trying to go into notably electric buses. You can see that a very, very large portion of that is battery electric buses, but we also had some fuel cell buses, a couple of trolley buses, and some gas buses in there as well. And one part that the sector is quite happy about is that part of the money can also be used for depot conversion, because that's another cost that operators are facing when using, for example, electric buses. Before moving on to the more general point on legislation, any particular questions to the CBD, because we're going to leave that one behind for a little moment to look at the bigger picture. I'll give you a moment to think about it, and otherwise I will continue. doesn't seem like there's any questions, don't worry, we'll have time later on. Don't be shy. And let me go on to the bigger picture. So you always hear about EU legislation, and I'm really going to try to break it down here today. What are we talking about when we talk about the European Green Deal? It's one of those buzzwords. I'm sure you've heard it mentioned in newsletters or in different newspapers. It basically means it's Europe's long-term climate strategy. It was introduced at the end of 2019 as the really big roadmap for the next years until 2030 and beyond to make sure that Europe meets its climate targets. It also included a climate law which introduced binding EU-wide legal targets for climate neutrality by 2050. So Europe has now this big ambition of being the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And everything that Europe does in this context, or the EU does, has to be seen with that in mind. So basically all the activities in the areas of climate, energy policy, transport, they all relate back to these very overarching, very large political goals that are legally binding. So there's also in that climate law an updated 2030 climate target of reducing emissions by 55% compared to 1990. So quite ambitious, but also generally agreed that it is necessary to avoid the negative effects of climate change and advance in that direction. Keep that 55% in mind because it's what the next package I'm going to talk about is named after. But first of all, Green Deal obviously also talks about transport. Basically, transport, one of the biggest emitters that we have, a quarter approximately of the EU's emissions are in the transport sector. And unfortunately, it's the only sector that hasn't really gotten any better since 1990. So there's quite a lot to do. And you can see here the shares of total EU greenhouse gas emissions. So this is not for the transport sector. This is how much the transport sector contributes in terms of emissions to the overall emissions of the EU. So you see the road sector with 20% being a major contributor. So that just to explain why transport is one of the topics that the EU and the EU Commission specifically is looking at quite closely. I did say I would come back to Fit for 55 and to 55 as a number, because that's the biggest package that was published so far to make sure that the Green Deal actually gets into legislation. So the thing with the Green Deal is it's a big strategy, but it's quite theoretical because it's big targets, but they aren't implemented yet in legislation. And that's where the Fit for 55 package comes in. So Fit for 55 as in fit for this emission reduction target that we're looking at, and is really the package that is supposed to implement the Green Deal. The package takes existing and new legislative proposals and tries to adapt each of them to fit the Green Deal goals. So we are looking at more strong push towards renewable energy. We're looking at energy efficiency in different areas. We're looking at energy taxation, greenhouse gas emissions overall and how they can be accounted for, and how emission trading functions, removing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So you can see it's quite a comprehensive package. So it touches various policy areas: climate, energy, fuels, transport, forestry, very, very big. We are only a very small part of it, but at UITP we took a really close look at this, because when you have a big package like that, it's quite easy to lose track of the very small bits. For example, the public transport sector is only a very small wheel in this big European collective of sectors of industries. So we've tried to look at how will this potentially impact us. And since I don't want to bore you to death with 12 different legislative proposals today, I've picked out one that is most relevant for what we're looking at today, and that's the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive and now regulation, which means, once again, directive has to be transposed nationally, regulation, the text applies the way it is in the member states directly. It focuses on publicly accessible infrastructure for private vehicles, also for heavy-duty vehicles, but there's quite a big focus on especially electric cars. And it's basically the Commission's way of saying, look, we need to build up more infrastructure. We need to make sure that people are able to choose electric cars if they want to. Hydrogen and LNG are also covered, but I would say the big selling point is really electrification, because that's what's predominant in the private vehicle sector at the moment. There's no rigid quotas or targets for public transport, which is something we are quite happy with, actually, because while we still need support, especially financially, to set up infrastructure in the member states, what members told us they didn't need is just infrastructure being set up without possibly being needed. So, for example, if you have a requirement to set up X amounts of hydrogen fueling station per X kilometers or square kilometers, then you could end up in a situation where a hydrogen refueling station is for buses is put in a place where nobody has any intention of buying hydrogen buses. So we said, instead of doing quotas like that, have member states consider public transport in the national policy plans that they have to make, which is already a requirement and which is going to be affirmed, at least the way the negotiations are looking. And then public transport can also be supported through this. So this entire Fit for 55 package, just for contextualization, is currently, it's a proposal by the Commission, and is currently being negotiated in the Council, so the Member States, and in the European Parliament. And that means the text isn't final yet, but we've got a general direction of where it's going, and it looks okay so far for us. The point why I brought this up today is this list of technologies, and for those of you who say this seems familiar, you would be right, because this is the directive that the Clean Vehicles Directive refers to for defining a clean bus. And that's why we were very attentive on looking at this closely and making sure that the list does not get reduced. Because what we've had from members is, okay, we've got the Clean Vehicles Directive, it's already in force, we're buying the vehicle types on the types of fuel that you have listed. And if you change this now, that is going to fundamentally mess with our plans. So we told that to the Commission, they understood that, they didn't change the list, and now we're saying the same thing to the Parliament. So the only thing they did is change it from a straightforward just listing to one with 3 segments. Legally, that doesn't change anything, but it means they do differentiate again between the fuels that they find more desirable, so electricity, hydrogen, ammonia, than what they call renewable fuels. And therefore, the first time we do have a distinction between synthetic and paraffinic fuels that are produced from renewable energy, and in the right column, the alternative fossil fuels, so LNG, and fuels that are produced from non-renewable energy. So you can see a tendency to have priorities from the side of the Commission. So zero emission electricity, hydrogen, clearly preferred by the Commission. There are a number of other dossiers that I can't go into detail on today, but within Fit for 55, I want to at least mention, so you've heard it once, there is an emission trading system, which is likely to be expanded to road transport as well. We do have that in some member states, but not in others. And at the moment, it's looking like private cars might not be in it, but only commercial operators. But at the same time, there might be a possibility of earmarking parts of the revenues. So if you sell emission certificates, member states get revenues, and they might be required to invest part of that back into public transport. And then there's a number of energy-related files, such as the Energy Efficiency Directive, which also looks at the public sector as being a good example and making buildings more efficient, making processes more efficient, and the Renewable Energy Directive, which, as the name states, tries to increase the share of renewables and sets more ambitious targets that we have currently. So much for Fit for 55. There's a number of developments that are currently ongoing, and the Commission has been bombarding us with proposals, including one new topic that was actually only published yesterday, which is Repower EU. This is basically the Commission's response to the war in Ukraine, where the Commission announced in March they would be proposing a big package to make Europe less dependent on especially Russian fossil fuels. So what they're trying to do with that package that got out yesterday is they're trying to accelerate the rollout of renewables. There's also recommendations in there to local and regional authorities, as well as to cities, to take some measures that include using more public transport, investing in public transport to make sure that citizens have a viable alternative to using their private cars. And I know that some of you are also very interested in hydrogen, and that's something that's also addressed. Unfortunately, I can't tell you any details today on the definition of renewable hydrogen, because while the Commission announced yesterday that they would be publishing some more detail on what is going to count as green hydrogen and what isn't, they actually haven't published it yet. So we are still waiting for that. Happy to give an update via IDA at another point, but this is all we know so far on this topic. I want to give you an idea of where the trends are going, and I'll pick 3 examples. There's a lot of strategies, a lot of legislative proposals at the moment, but we see the same trends repeating themselves in several different circumstances. First of all, in Fit for 55, we also had CO2 emission targets for cars and vans. While that doesn't concern you, that gives you an indication of what the Commission is thinking. And in this case, the Commission proposed that from 2035 onwards, all newly registered cars are to be emission-free. So basically, no combustion engines any longer for cars as from 2035. That to give you an idea of the tendency the Commission has at the moment. The same also applies similarly in the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy. If we hear the word strategy, it always means it's not binding, but it talks about the Commission's intentions. This means, in that case, they mention several things, but among others, that they would like collective travel under 500 kilometre to be carbon neutral by 2030. Again, not a binding target, but it shows what they're thinking approximately. And then lastly, the EU taxonomy, which is a way to direct investments towards sustainable projects and activities. So it's a financial directive, but affects all sectors. And for public transport, it only lists zero emission as such a sustainable activity. So that should give you a general idea of where the Commission is going, all of these 3 points taken together. And then the big question, will there be a CBD 2.0? The problem, in brackets, with the current CBD is that it was actually published before the Green Deal. We can assume that had the CBD been revised after the Green Deal, it would have been a bit more ambitious, even more so than it already is. So in the CBD currently, it's foreseen that the Commission shall review the implementation and the way it works by the end of 2027. And just to sketch out a possible scenario, this is not for sure, but just my intuition on the way things could go would be that we're probably going to see a review before the end of the second reference period, and so before the end of 2030. To give you an idea, the Renewable Energy Directive, which is currently being reviewed, was only changed in 2018 beforehand. So the periods can be a lot shorter than what's initially foreseen in the directives or regulations themselves. And I do assume that the Commission will want to act on this topic, either through the CBD or through another directive. I believe we will also probably see a departure from the clean definition based on list of fuels, since that was purely a placeholder because the Commission didn't have any other option. And it's likely that similarly to cars, we will see more strict CO2 emission standards with a stronger emphasis on zero emission. That's it so far from me. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm looking forward to a discussion with you.
Thanks a lot, Lucie. Very complete and detailed overview. We have one question from the chat from Rob. He's asking, is UK still bound by the directive?
The UK is still in the text of the directive, but I don't believe it wants to apply the directive. So I'm not aware that they have transposed it, and to be quite frank, I would be extremely surprised if they did. That being said, the UK still, despite Brexit, is applying some stuff voluntarily. So some things, for example, standards they are still applying, but I don't expect them to go with this one, at least not in the way that the Commission wrote it. We could have something similar, based maybe on some of the ideas that we have in the CBD, but yeah, don't expect the UK to follow this.
Thank you. Also, Josep Maria from TMB.
Hello, thank you, Lucy, for your to be more clear. Only I want to share our situation in Spain, because there was a transposition from the directive from the EU directive to Spanish legislation, and nowadays our clean buses, CNG was a clean buses in the past, nowadays it's not clean. CNG is not clean. It's like a diesel, except if it's biodiesel, biogas. In this case, if it's biogas, the problem that is in Spain we don't have biogas, and then what we don't know, our next acquisitions of buses. For 2024 probably is not a problem, but for the next period of time until 2030 probably we will have problems, because we have our fleet is 500 buses is CNG and the rest is diesel hybrids, and now we are buying hydrogen and electric buses. But the idea to acquire more zero emission buses is quite slowly. It's quite impossible to do these acquisitions as fast as the European asks us. Our legislation, not the European ones. It's only to share our problem.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Unfortunately, my Spanish, I don't believe is good enough to actually read it. Otherwise, I would be really interested in looking at that. It's something that we call gold plating. So basically putting a thin layer of gold onto something when national states decide to go beyond the European ambition. And then sort of, they tend to sometimes use the European Union also as a scapegoat, saying, look, we're applying this European legislation. This is the goals that we're going for. And you can go as a member state beyond what the EU asks you to do, of course. But in that case, yeah, it does sound very challenging, especially if you've already invested in infrastructure for gas, if you've got the refueling stations, because that's always quite long-term investments that you're thinking you're doing just to also use for the next years to come and for more buses.
Josep Maria, what we can offer there is to check together the transposition into the Spanish legislation. I can do that. I am happy to help with that. And I will align with Lucy to try to understand if we can provide you further answers into this aspect. But definitely, of course, yeah, if the national transpositions go beyond the targets of the Clean Vehicle Directive at the EU level, I guess it's not much that we can do in this sense. Perhaps also trying to understand what were the purposes behind this going beyond the targets in the transposition. And I don't know if there is any way also to understand what the next steps would be at the national level. If it's okay for you, just yeah, let's arrange a bilateral call on this. You send me the document or the link to the transposition, and we can discuss it together for sure. I can imagine perhaps that's not just a case of Spain. Could be other member states that might be facing this challenge. Still, what we said in the last discussions we had on the topic was also that even if we have quotas to be applied until the end of 2025, and then on the second period, we still have a bit of room above the quotas to decide which technologies we would like to procure. But obviously, if we see that the Commission is going towards zero emissions, I would understand perhaps that's one of the reasons why at the national level there might be, together with the pressure from the issues with air pollution. We have this in Madrid, we have this in Barcelona, even in Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. So there is definitely urgent action to be taken. But yeah, this is something that we can definitely see together afterwards.
Thank you.
Sure. Anton.
Yes, José Maria, in Paris, we try to promote biogas too as part of the solution, and especially when the biogas come from human waste or vegetables waste or everything as waste management system produced by waste management system. So we are trying to, and especially after during this crisis, this energy crisis, in a moment of war, we try to promote once again this energy, but it's not easy. But we are trying to.
Thanks a lot, François. More questions? Please go ahead. I think that's definitely a unique golden opportunity having Lucie here. Jan, go ahead.
Good morning, all. That's not a question, but information about the situation in Czech Republic. The situation in Czech Republic, it's in the cities. We have a lot of trolleybuses, partial trolleybuses projects. So in the cities, we will be able to satisfy the targets of Clean Vehicle Directives. In some cities, they are quite depending on CNG. Also, in some cities, will be the same situation like in Barcelona. Hopefully not in Prague, but they will also discuss the waste using the possibilities of waste and bio CNG, but they are not enough sources for whole fleet and for the percentage we will need. But situation in regions in Czech Republic will be quite complicated, especially because they are also discussing the CNG possibilities, and today's situation will be quite complicated also by the economic situation, by the dramatic increasing prices even of CNG. So in regions, they will be used exceptions of CNG of Clean Vehicle Directive. So they will be asking for vehicle class 2. So the results in Czech Republic will be that cities will try to satisfy Clean Vehicle Directives, by region will accept and will try to weigh how to not satisfy it, but how to use all exception possibilities.
Yeah, that is the benefit of only having M3 class 1 and A being included.
Yeah, so that's the result is that we also complained that before in the process that Clean Vehicle Directive it's nice for promoting, but it's not fair. It's not fair for all. So I'm happy. Yeah. I'm happy that there is a discussion for the next edition of Clean Vehicle Directive, much more about real CO2 emission measuring and not measuring number of vehicles, and not comparing small electric vehicle and big articulated vehicle the same, because the emission they are quite different. But we have a lot of discussion inside the bus committee on that. So thank you.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, the new CVD, it's just a general thought that we will have a new one at one point. We don't have any time frame on that, and there's nothing official announced, so don't expect anything to happen in the next couple of years. Generally, if something were to happen, it would be quite more ambitious than what we have now. And what we also struggled with is really explaining the realities during the process, the legislative process, because a lot of it is big political ideas. So a lot of it is saying, okay, we're going for zero emission across the board, but it's not going to be very likely that it's going to be more nuanced and it's going to take into consideration a lot of the regional realities. That's really more of a member state procedure where, for example, the member state could say the bigger cities need to have a bigger contribution, while the smaller cities or the regions, in your case as well, don't contribute that much or don't contribute at all. We have a lot of cities that are going for zero emission already, that have got quite ambitious goals, but I don't think in the sum it's entirely enough to compensate for all the regions that need buses as well. Yeah, so definitely a difficult situation.
Thank you.
Also, in terms of the purpose of this project, most of the participants today are members of the Clean Bus Europe platform. Definitely, the purpose of the project is not only to exchange, but basically this exchange on how to deploy clean buses, how to arrange all the activities and all the different tasks that we need to renew our fleets. It's also indirectly, obviously, supporting the implementation of the Clean Vehicle Directive. But I totally agree that depending on the regions in Europe and European member states and also the state of the deployment, it's going to be more challenging for some cities, some regions than others. Also not easy right now due to the geopolitical situation we are facing. On a personal note, I think it's quite encouraging is to see that there is a clear will from the Commission to go away from concrete sources of energy that can be limited in the future and can pose an additional threat on the energy supply. On the other side, I also see that betting mostly for electricity can also create struggles in the next 5-10 years. This is only my very personal view on it, but I would favor a diversified portfolio, which indeed considers the CO2 emissions of the different technologies and the vehicles we are talking about, and based on that, create a stronger resilience on the fleets that are serving public transport purposes. We will see how these aspects develop. I think the most important note today is that even with the limits established within the directive and the national transposition, I think it's very interesting the case in Spain, which is going beyond, that we can provide some answers on how to address this, at least for the first period, and what will be in the future. For the next second period, perhaps it's on the hands of the Commission and also the discussions of our colleagues, among many other colleagues advocating for public transport towards the Commission. I don't know if there is an additional question. We can take them also after the webinar. Feel free to contact me. I can pass the questions to Lucie. If not, I would just like to remember you, if Lucie, you can go just 2 slides further, just on the next webinar, the next one.
That's it, I'm afraid.
Not appearing. Okay,
No,
1 second.
If you want to share yours, I don't
Yes,
think it's much.
I'm doing that. I'm doing that 1 second. Yes, it's just to remind you, you have received also the email invitation, just to remind you on the next webinar, which is taking place on Wednesday, 25th of May, also this time, 11 to 12, on the topic planning for clean buses, where to start. We will be going through the different phases. We will focus also on the role of the different stakeholders and just having some indications how to deal with the preparations when it comes, of course, to the tendering, commissioning and operation. And we will focus also on the case of battery buses. I think all of you know our next speaker, Mark van Hout. He was former bus fleet director at Transdev, and now he is consultant for HANSEA, but is a UITP honorary member. So he will be our speaker for the next webinar. But today, I think we had an amazing overview on all the challenges and also the opportunities that the directive and the different policies applying to clean bus deployment is bringing to the public bus sector. Thanks to Lucie Petersen. So thank you very much, Lucie, for your expert view on all these topics. And I think we can just thank her for the very detailed insights. And if there is any additional question aspect, again, please feel free. Soon slides will be uploaded, recording as well. Always a pleasure to see you, to have the chance to exchange with you and to understand how we can further help. So reach out to us whenever needed. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.